Hello, and welcome to our lesson on Western expansion, Plains Indians, and Manifest Destiny. Standard 12 essential question asks, how did the westward expansion of the United States affect the Plains Indians and fulfill the idea of manifest destiny? And if you remember back a couple of chapters ago, we studied manifest destiny, and that was the idea that we were destined or going to stretch our nation from the East Coast to the West Coast, from one ocean to the next. Some of the words that we need to understand for this lesson are terms manifest destiny, the Transcontinental Railroad, and resistance. In Lesson 1, we will discuss the Transcontinental Railroad. Our essential question asks, how was the first Transcontinental Railroad constructed, including the role of immigrant labor? Now, the Transcontinental Railroad happens at the end of the Civil War. In the West at the Great Plains and through the deserts of the Southwest. It also covered areas where we already had Native Americans living, groups such as the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Comanche, and the Pueblo. The Transcontinental Railroad was a railway link that was going to connect the east and the west part of the nation. Congress provided money in two ways to build our railroads, through the Pacific Railway Act. They, one, gave loans, and secondly, they gave land grants, gave builders a wide stretch of land that they could build on. There were two rail companies that were instrumental in building our transcontinental railroad system. The Central Pacific laid tracks going east from California, and the Union Pacific laid tracks going west from Nebraska. They will meet in 1869 in Utah in a city called Promontory Point. And this will fulfill the idea of manifest destiny, that we stretch from the east to the west. This is a picture of the day that the two rail companies met. Labor to build this transcontinental railroad was twofold. You had Chinese laborers and you also had Irish laborers. The Central Pacific used the Chinese labor. They were closer, coming from Asia, so it was easier for them to join with the labor companies, or the rail companies, and build with them. However, they accepted lower wages, and we're going to get to why those groups were lower wage workers. They also worked in very dangerous conditions. They used explosives to go through the rocks in the mountains. They were involved in rock slides and mountain slides and things of that nature, and they had to endure heavy snowfalls. The Union Pacific used Irish labor, and that's because they were coming from Europe, and on that side, they were coming from the east to the west. In Lesson 2, let's look at the growth in the West and the effects on Native Americans. Our essential question asks, how did the growth in the number of settlers in the West and innovations in farming and ranching affect the Plains Indians? And going back to our previous lesson, remember we've already talked about the groups that can be considered Plains Indians. The Great Plains was originally set aside for Indians and had very little whites that had settled there. Remember, this is also taking place after the Trail of Tears, so a lot of them have been moved from the east to the west already. The railroad made it easier for people to move west, especially with the Transcontinental Railroad being built. And as more settlers start to move in, and innovations or improvements are brought forth, those innovations help increase the white population, and it's going to affect the Plains Indians greatly. Four of the things that inventions that impact the way Native Americans were used to living on their land were barbed wire, the plow, the grain drill, and windmills. You may think, how does this affect Native Americans? Well, Native Americans do believe in sharing of land instead of ownership of land. And these white settlers were coming in and dividing up the land. That's why the barbed wire was so important. They could mark off their territory and keep their animals in check. Native Americans did not practice that. They let the animals roam, and they would follow where the food was going. The impact on the Plains Indians. Their lifestyle had been threatened. They were no longer able to be nomadic and move from place to place wherever their food supply was. There was also a decrease in their food supply. The buffalo was very important to their survival, and a lot of them were being killed off by the new settlers. It says that the settlers destroyed the buffalo population from 15 million in 1865 to just 600 by 1886. White settlers also introduced diseases that the Native Americans had no immunity to, and this is before vaccinations. So a lot of them were dying out, just like they did when the first group of settlers came here on the East Coast. Life on the reservations, although they were able to practice their traditional way of life, they were often put on undesirable land that was hard to farm, and they were also left with insufficient food and supplies that the federal government was supposed to give to them or to help them with. Also, the federal government and missionaries established reservation schools. These schools were to teach how to be a good Christian, so to convert them from their native beliefs, farming, and how to become a U.S. citizen. You have to remember, Native Americans really are the last group to get formal citizenship, even though they're the first people here. You also had reformers that wanted them to assimilate. That means they wanted to Americanize them. Many Native Americans or Plains Indians were encouraged to send their children away to boarding schools that were established by missionaries to convert them to what Americanism was like, to their values and traditions of the United States. And then you have the Dawes Act, which also Americanizes male adult Indians by promising them 600 acres of reservation land. But it led to selling off further those native lands to the United States. And these are some pictures of the buffalo and how they were destroyed. The buffalo hides. Lesson 3. How did the Plains Indians resist the western expansion of the U.S., and what were the consequences of their resistance? So now they're fighting back. Now the conflict for the Native Americans is over land. That is the biggest part. Indians needed it for hunting. The settlers wanted it for farming and mining. Gold is going to be discovered back in parts of the West, and so as the gold is found, more and more people are going to rush there. The U.S. agreed to give the Sioux Nation a large reservation in the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. But that treaty is broken when gold is found in the Black Hills. So everybody, all the settlers start to run into that area, hoping to get wealthy. One significant battle that we're going to discuss is the Battle of Little Bighorn. As we just mentioned prior, gold has been discovered, and so the settlers are moving into this area by great numbers. Sioux leaders such as Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull would lead the Sioux to drive out the U.S. Army. They were there to look and tour the land, and it was a violation. So if you see where it says George Custer violated the treaty by taking the troops, the army, and miners to tour the reserved land. They were not supposed to be there because it was set aside for the Native Americans, not for the U.S. government. So a battle takes place at Little Bighorn, where the Sioux Indians are going to surround the American army. They stumble upon 2,000 Indians, and all of Custer's men and Custer were killed in this battle. The second battle of interest is the Battle of Wounded Knee. It says, with the loss of many leaders and people, the Native American fight was finished and the U.S. diminished most of their population. Sitting Bull will be arrested and others will be killed. The rest of the Native Americans will flee and U.S. Army takes up after them. You will have a battle that takes place at Wounded Knee when they return to fight for their land. But the Native Americans are greatly outnumbered. They are defeated in this battle, and this ends any Native American resistance to the U.S. government. This is pretty much where they surrender to whatever the U.S. government wants to do to them. And this is footage of Bigfoot's body, or Chief Bigfoot, at Wounded Knee.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 29th of December 1890, more than 150 Native Americans from the Lakota tribe were killed by U.S. soldiers in the Wounded Knee massacre. The 19th century saw white settlers move westward across North America in accordance with the disputed ideology of manifest destiny. The resulting forced relocation of Native Americans led to a series of conflicts collectively known as the American Indian Wars. Yet, by 1890, settlers and gold miners had begun to encroach on the new reservation, while the bison, on which the people of the Great Plains depended, had been almost wiped out. In desperation, the native people began to turn to performing the ghost dance that promised to bring about a revival of their pre-European existence. White Americans, fearing that the ghost dance might be a prelude to war, decided to act. In a botched attempt to arrest the Lakota Sioux chief Sitting Bull, he was shot and killed. This raised tensions in the native community, resulting in hundreds of people, led by Chief Spotted Elk, opting to head for the safety of the Pine Ridge Reservation. Having been intercepted by a detachment of U.S. 7th Cavalry, the Lakota set up camp near Wounded Knee Creek on the 28th of December. The next morning, Colonel James Forsyth ordered the Native Americans to surrender their weapons. Some sources then allege that a medicine man named Yellow Bird antagonized the U.S. troops by performing a ghost dance. Meanwhile, a young Lakota named Black Coyote engaged in a scuffle after he refused to give up his rifle, possibly because he was deaf or he didn't understand the order to disarm. In the commotion that followed, a rifle discharged, prompting a frantic gunfight that killed at least 150 and possibly possibly as many as 300 tribespeople, many of whom were old men, women, and children.
This concludes the lecture for today. Have a good day.